Welcome. Today we are finally moving into the first part, pars prima, which also does include our second introduction. Welcome. We are here at the first part, pars prima. The subtitle for this is that Johannes Climacus begins to philosophize with the aid of traditional ideas. So, what is this traditional philosophy that we're talking about? Well, if we look at his sketch of what Kierkegaard was planning on doing, chapter 1 would have addressed some Danish philosophy, traditional concepts, things that would have been known, while moving into chapter 2 would focus on Hegel, chapter 3 on Kant, and chapter 4 would focus more on Descartes and Spinoza. This corresponds with what we see in the first part, that modern philosophy begins to doubt, that philosophy begins with doubt, and in order to philosophize, one must have doubted. And this is the course of the first part. So now let us begin with the second introduction, the introduction to the first part. He states, although he had been a student for a few years, Johannes had done relatively little reading, especially for a student. In grammar school, he had become well acquainted with the classics and was happy to go through them again, although their substance had no effect upon what was going on inside of him. What thoughts he had, right? I mean, it was just entertainment. It didn't have any realm of thought that he was connected to. On occasion, one or another modern work came into his hands, but he had no perception of what significance the reading of it should have for him. Historical works did not engage him because the predominant development of his mind had deprived him of the sense of empirical actuality. Right? What actually happened doesn't seem as important as what could happen, right? The actual perceptions. And again, if we think of Johannes's whole world just being imagination as laid out for his father, what actually seems to have taken place seems to hold very little weight and wouldn't really matter as much in his formation going forward. This, combined with the fact that he was usually indifferent to what other people said and thought, if it had no relation to thinking, also made him a little less interested in history and the actual development. He was indifferent to all accounts of what was said and done by those who had lived earlier. If he encountered a recent philosophical work, he of course did not lay it aside before he had read it, but when he had read it, he often felt dissatisfied and discouraged. His whole orientation of mind made him feel uncomfortable about reading. At times a title would tempt him, and he would go to the book and gladly and expectantly, but lo and behold, it would discuss many other things, least of all which one would have expected. If at length he worked his way little by little through what the title had justified his searching for, the thought process would frequently be interrupted by the matter left undecided. He was often annoyed to find so much attention paid to what appeared to him to be incidentals. This might be something that many of you share with Kierkegaard here, Johannes Climacus's character, that we're engaged in this, and some of this is really thought-provoking. But some of it, you're like, really, we're spending a lot of time on this thing. Like, what's the practical effect? What are we going to do with this? What should we expect out of it? The investigation would be interrupted, he says, in order to correct one or another singular opinion advanced by some author totally unknown to him. Right? Oh, by the way, the real attention is something that you're not paying attention to. Right? The real focus of this work is how it addresses some thinker that you're not familiar with, and yet this is what the author thought was the most engaging and spent all of their effort trying to produce and argue and articulate. For him, for Johannes, to understand this digression properly would require a prior reading of that man's work. That in turn perhaps would presuppose others, etc. He also thought, he observed, that the reason for incorporating a particular opinion of a particular author would be a very peculiar one, because he lived in the same city as the writer, because he wrote in the same journal, etc. Like, why is it that people choose to write on what they write on, what strikes their fancy? And then you have to do their reading and their work, and you're going to realize that Well, this work is really building off of this other work, and so you have to engage in that one. And all of a sudden, to fully engage in anyone else's thought, you have to trace their whole lineage of thought straight through to the conclusion. He also didn't always find rigorous dialectical movement. Right? The actual engagement might not have been that engaging. He sadly missed the wonderful sport of dialectic and its puzzling surprises. And really, this is somewhat of a critique of modern philosophy. Kierkegaard is kind of teasing out what he sees as kind of the product of modernity, that what we decide to engage with is usually just kind of what interests us, which is fair, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have these broader, more important answers that it's trying to arrive at. After having made several attempts, he gave up reading. He once again devoted himself to his own thinking, even if it did not lead him to anything. He refrained, however, from any hasty judgments about those particular books or about books in general. He heard others make altogether different judgments and concluded that the fault would be his own. What do we see? Well, problems could exist, but they might not be, because of the author. You just might not understand it. That it might not have that engagement for you because it's not your particular fancy. Or that a point might be over your head and you're missing the greater connections because you didn't bother to make those connections. And that, his upbringing had been deficient, and that even if it had not taught him anything else, it still had taught him to draw this conclusion. You need to look towards Kant here, this little line, right? Have the courage to use your own intelligence. It might not be right, but at least stand on your own ideas is what's being encouraged here. In listening to others talk, he also observed that he had not encountered the writings of great thinkers among the recent philosophers. Again and again he heard these same names mentioned with enthusiasm, almost with adoration. It gave him unspeakable joy to hear their names, even though he did not dare to read them, because he had heard that they were so difficult that the study of them would require ages. This is, of course, the difficulty of any work. If it's monumental and important enough, you really need a lot of time and encouragement to go through and to tease out these ideas. What we're doing in this class, for instance, is a fantastic introduction to these ideas and these great thinkers, but it doesn't address their entirety of thought. To do that would require your book list being exponentially larger than it currently is, and would really be the focus of your entire academic and possibly professional career. It was not cowardice or indolence that deterred him, but a painful feeling inherent in him from early childhood that he was not like other people. He was far from feeling happy about this difference, but instead he felt it as a pressure he probably would have to endure all of his life. He felt like a child who was delivered into the world with much pain, and who could not forget this pain, even if his mother had forgotten it in her joy over his birth. As for reading, Johannes now experienced a strange contradiction. The familiar books did not satisfy him, but still he didn't dare to lay the blame on the books. The outstanding books he did not dare to read. So he read less and less, followed his inclination to ponder in silence, became increasingly shy, fearful that the major thinkers would smile at him if they heard that he too wanted to think, just as fine ladies smile at lowly maiden if she has the audacity of also wanting to know the bliss of erotic love. He was silent, but listened all the more attentively. In many ways, this is what I'm trying to encourage you guys not to do. Right? The activity, the task ahead of you is to find an idea throughout this book and tease it out. Tease out, what it is that this book is saying in connection with another. to have the courage to use your own intelligence, as Kant would say, to ponder and to think, not just in silence, but through expression, through telling me, yourself, and others what these ideas mean and what the conclusions of them should be. Continuing at the bottom of 130 and moving on to 131, when he listened to others speak, he noted that a particular main idea came up again and again, whereupon he snatched it and made it the object of his own thinking. As we are reading and discussing different philosophical works, you might be encountering some ideas over and over again, and the job, the task ahead of you is to grab that and to run with it. Thus, the fate came to his aid by providing him the subject that he exactly needed it, in the way that he needed it. The purer, the more virginal, so to speak, the task, the more precious it was to him. The less others had assisted his thinking, the happier he was, and the better everything went for him. In many ways, if you're encountering an idea fresh, an intriguing notion that you can engage in, you're able to produce a little bit more. In fact, it would be of benefit to ask some people about an idea that they've not encountered at all. Wise people, people who are capable of engaging in thought, those would be the ones you should address, but what is it they do? They hear an idea, they mull it over, they kind of bounce it around back and forth, and they give you an idea. They don't hold all of the preconceived ideas about the outcome. Sometimes people are caught up too much in their own systems and what their expectations of an outcome are to actually engage an idea honestly. And so this is the sort of realm that Johannes admired the most. When he hears an idea that doesn't have any preconceived ideas that give him this conclusion already, or a particular method in which he has to address it, he's able to wrestle around with the ideas and eventually produce something that he thinks is superior. Though, he says, Johannes seemed to consider it an imperfection, that he could do his best thinking about an idea if it had came to him as new fallen snow without having passed through the hands of others. He truly considered it a great thing to be able, as were the others, to toss about in multiple thoughts of multiple thinkers. In some ways, there is this advantage of being able to say, look who's drawn in this conclusion, this thought, right? This is what I'm doing with this text. This is why you're listening to me read it instead of just reading it on your own. Because I will tell you, pause, stop, think, notice here, notice these connections, and draw these connections. If you're capable of doing so as well, congratulations, that's the task that's at hand. Yet he soon forgot this pain in the joy of thinking. By listening to the conversation of others, he became particularly aware of one thesis that came up again and again, and passed from mouth to mouth, that was always praised and always venerated. And he's going to say in the margin, he wrote, many were the times that he heard it repeated, de omnibus datium est, that everything must be doubted. That this is the words that he's using over and over again. And in many ways, this is part of the task of the philosopher. That you need to doubt something. You need to figure out why something is true. And then move with that and proceed with that. And figure out what's worth holding on to and what's worth letting go. What things does doubt strengthen and what things does doubt destroy? That he now encountered the thesis that would come to play a decisive role in his life. This thesis became, for his life, what in other respects a name frequently is in a person's history. Everything can be said in all brevity by mentioning this name. This thesis became a task for his thinking. Whether it would take a long or a short time to think it through, he did not know. But this he did know. Until that time came, he would not let go of it, even though it were to cost him his life. What made him even more enthusiastic was the connection usually made between this thesis and becoming a philosopher. Indeed, here's the thought, right? The idea of being a philosopher intrigued him. It's not anything he thought he could actually achieve, but if indeed he can do this task, to engage in this thesis, the omnibus dathiumest, then maybe indeed he too would be a philosopher. He didn't know if he could do this, but he would do his best. With quiet solemnity, it was decreed that he should begin. He encouraged himself by recalling the enthusiasm of Dion, who, upon going aboard ship with a handful of men to begin the war with Dionysius, said, "It is enough for me just to have participated." We should note real quickly that this is a reference to Dion of Syracuse, and the Dionysius we're addressing is not Dionysius the Areopagite, to whom we are addressing in our philosophy class. It's more a tension about internal matters in Syracuse, but was apparent during the life of Plato and Aristotle, and they wrote about it and spoke about this issue. But we can take from this the inspiration about just engaging into this. So there's value, even if you don't succeed in this task, in your participation. He concludes on the bottom of 131, "If I were to die the moment I set foot on land, without having achieved a thing, I would still regard this death as happy and honorable." Right? That there's value in this struggle back against an opponent of yours, even if you don't succeed, that you've participated, that you've engaged in the fight. And therefore, this is what we're being called to do as philosophers. We're to follow what's been urged on by Descartes, this idea that all things must be doubted. He now sought to clarify for himself the connection between that thesis, that everything must be doubted, and philosophy. Preoccupation with it would become for him an encouraging prelude. The clearer the connection became, the more enthusiastically he would proceed to the main concern. So he closed himself up in himself with that philosophical thesis. At the same time, he paid careful attention to every clue he could glean. If he perceived that his own thought process was different from that of others, he memorized theirs, went home, and began all over from the very beginning. That their thought process was generally very brief did not strike him, but he saw that only as a new point of their advantage. Now he began his operations and immediately juxtaposed three principal statements. These are the statements, the titles of the next three chapters here in the first part, right? That he had heard regarding the relation of this thesis to philosophy. These three theses were as follows: that philosophy begins to doubt, that in order to philosophize one must have doubted, and modern philosophy begins with doubt. These are the three ideas to which we will turn our attention to next.